So let's talk about the death penalty and Christian scripture. A lot of people will point to Leviticus 24:19-21 in defense of the death penalty. You know the passage. "And a man who injures his countryman, as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth." Another version exists in Exodus 21:22-24, which addresses people hurting pregnant women. And while on the surface this scripture may seem to endorse the death penalty, these scriptures actually don't. Their purpose is to endorse proportionality of justice. For example, if I borrowed my neighbor's horse to plow a field, and the horse falls into a ditch and dies, I can't just repay my neighbor with a live chicken. I need to repay her with a live horse. That is what the laws in Leviticus and Exodus are referring to. They're referring to proportionality of wrongdoing. And what I actually want to do is to point to the larger collection of stories in Scripture. Because as Brent Strawn, one of my former Old Testament professors, is fond of saying, the Bible can be a lot like the New York City Public Library. You can find a lot of stuff in the New York City Public Library. It just depends on what you want to find. Similarly, there's a lot of stuff you can find in the Bible. It all depends on what you want to find. And it's very easy for us to find a verse and hold it as a rule by which we measure everything else. But we need to read the entirety of the Bible to see if that scripture squares with everything else in it. If we do that with the death penalty, we actually don't see Christian and Hebrew scriptures endorsing the death penalty. Rather, we see just the opposite. We see God's grace intervening. Take the story of Cain and Abel, for instance. This is the first murder in Scripture. And what we see with Abel's murder is that creation is torn apart in a way that cannot be restored. Abel's blood literally cries out from the ground to God. God is grieved and has every right to take away Cain's life. But God doesn't take Cain's life. Instead, God banishes him from his family, which is a kind of punishment, but places a special mark on him so that he will be protected and not be murdered himself. God does not want to grieve both of these men's deaths. Cain receives God's grace, love, and forgiveness. And he will have to spend the rest of his life in exile, in a different community, thinking about what he did, living into that love and forgiveness that he was given in spite of his actions. Not a fan of the story of Cain and Abel? Let's talk Moses then. Though we know Moses as the man who discovered God in the burning bush and the liberator of enslaved Israelites, or the leader who brought people through temptation and 40 years living in the desert wilderness, before all of that, Moses was a Hebrew man who fled town to evade charges after murdering an Egyptian. But did God demand that Moses' blood be shed so that there could be restitution? No. God preserved Moses' life, that he could use his experiences of exile to be a witness for God and God's power. Imagine what Hebrew scripture would be like if Moses was killed on God's orders. It might look completely different. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, why, Hillary, are we only talking about the Old Testament? What about the New Testament and the death penalty? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, the New Testament is even more adamant when it comes to God's grace being given indiscriminately to people who deserve capital punishment in the eyes of society. You've got Saul, who used to hunt Christians down for sport. Enjoying the public executions. But does God strike Saul down with a bolt of lightning after the killings that Saul has ordered? Not at all. You know the story. Instead, God strikes Saul senseless on the road to Damascus, makes him wrestle with the malice inside of his soul for 3 days, and then sends a Christian to help him experience healing, wholeness, and a new understanding of grace. When Saul adopts the new name Paul, he adopts a new understanding of God. God is not an executioner waiting for us to trip up and swing the sword to cut off our heads. God is a God who balances grace and responsibility, in the words of John Wesley. God is a God who transforms the parts of us that are death-dealing into life-giving parts. And God does this through the life-giving person of Jesus Christ. Let's not forget that of all the people who deserved death in Scripture, Jesus was not one of them. Jesus is God with us, a being both fully divine and fully human at the same time. Jesus showed love indiscriminately, even when he was angry, but ironically, though he did nothing wrong, Jesus was completely innocent of the crimes of which he was accused. He was sentenced to capital punishment by the Roman state. He died by crucifixion, which is the ancient equivalent of both the lynching tree and the electric chair. Who would Jesus execute? Nobody. Jesus, the Son of God, does not condemn people to death. Not the people who do wrong against God or their neighbors, not the people who execute him. Nobody, because nobody is beyond redemption, and we are more than the worst thing we've ever done, and we are more than the worst thing that's ever happened to us. It is we humans who choose death. And in spite of that, God chooses life and calls us to choose life too.
There are, of course, many resources available to learn more, some of which are listed in a document linked in the description of this video. These resources tend to lean more toward the perspective of those who would abolish the death penalty. This is for two reasons. First, it's in line with the 1991 social statement of the ELCA. Secondly, the death penalty is the current status quo. Since those in favor of capital punishment don't need to change the system, there aren't as many resources devoted to that work. I am deeply grateful to the people who appeared on this video and all other South Carolina Lutherans who responded to the call of the Synod Assembly by providing time, thoughtful insights, stories, and perspectives about the death penalty. It is our hope that this work will inspire conversation in congregations about how the good news of Jesus Christ takes shape in our world today through this and other moral issues.